It's 3000 BCE. You're sitting near the banks of the Euphrates River, cradling a newborn baby. There's no hospital bill arriving in the mail, no Wi-Fi, and no group text to blast out photo updates to your relatives. To everyone in your village, this child is a miracle, another mouth to feed, and eventually a fresh pair of hands to harvest wheat. But across the river, sitting inside a sun-baked mud brick palace, a man holding a damp clay tablet is asking a very strange question: who owns this child? This is the story of birth registration, not the piece of paper tucked in your file cabinet, not the plastic ID card sitting in your wallet. We are talking about the exact moment human beings stopped being just living creatures to their tribe and became numbered assets listed on a government ledger. For most of human existence, nobody wrote down that you were born. You arrived, your tribe celebrated or worried about food, and that was it. You belonged to a community, not a country. Nobody needed a certificate to prove you existed because everyone who knew you could simply look at your face. So why did that change? Why would a king, an emperor, or a tax collector care that a brand new tiny human being who can't even hold up its own head just entered the world? The short answer is control, but the long answer is much weirder, much darker, and tells us everything about how the modern world was built. It all started when humans stopped chasing wild animals and started growing wheat. Once you settle in one place and build farms, you create wealth. And once you create wealth, someone inevitably stands up, puts on a fancy crown, and declares themselves the ruler. But ruling a kingdom takes money and labor. You need soldiers to fight off neighboring kings, and you need workers to dig irrigation canals. To get those things, you need to know how many people live on your land. Early empires in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt figured this out quickly, and the evidence for this is better than you'd think. Historians actually agree on this one. Rulers began conducting censuses, counting households to figure out how much grain they could demand in taxes. But these early headcounts were broad and messy. They usually only counted adult men or heads of households. They didn't care about a baby born yesterday because a baby couldn't hold a spear or swing an axe. Over in Han Dynasty China, rulers took this a step further. They built a massive system of household records that tracked family members closely. If your name was on the bamboo scroll, the imperial government knew where to find you when it came time to collect taxes or drag you off to serve in the military. Still, this was mostly about counting families, not giving every newborn an official individual identity from day one. Enter the Roman Empire. If there was one thing ancient Romans loved more than building roads and marching in straight lines, it was bureaucracy. Around the time of Christ, Emperor Augustus was looking out over his vast empire and facing a problem. Augustus was deeply obsessed with social order, inheritance rights, and making sure that only legitimate Roman citizens enjoyed the tax perks and legal protections of empire. Honestly, respect for the ambition, even if he was a nightmare to live under. So, Augustus passed laws requiring Roman citizens to declare the birth of every child within 30 days. A government clerk would log the child's name, the parents' names, and the date of birth on a wooden tablet. For the first time in recorded history, an individual human being had an official, state-recognized document proving their legal existence from infancy. Think about what that actually means. Before this, your identity was defined by the people who knew your name. After this, your identity was defined by a piece of wood stored in a public archive. If you had the record, you were a citizen who could inherit property and appeal to Roman law. If you didn't, you were nobody. Simple as 1 + 1. When Rome fell, that grand government system collapsed with it. But the idea of recording births didn't die. It just moved into a different building, the church. For hundreds of years across medieval Europe, the state didn't care much about registering individual births, but the church cared deeply about your soul. Priests began writing down the names of babies when they were baptized. At first, these records were messy and depended entirely on whether a local priest felt like keeping a clean notebook. Then came Thomas Cromwell in 1538. Cromwell was the chief advisor to King Henry VIII, a man who spent his career turning government efficiency into a terrifying art form. Cromwell ordered every single parish priest in England to keep a secured chest with 2 locks, containing a book that recorded every baptism, marriage, and burial in the parish. A few decades later, the Catholic Church did the exact same thing across Europe at the Council of Trent. Notice what happened there. The church thought it was tracking souls saved from original sin. The state realized it was getting a free, perfectly updated map of the nation's future taxpayers. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world was changing again. Factories were rising, cities were exploding, and governments were becoming vast administrative machines. A baptism record wasn't enough anymore. What if the parents were Jewish? What if they were atheists? What if they belonged to a minor religious group? A modern state couldn't let religious affiliation get in the way of tracking its population. This brings us to Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1804, Napoleon introduced his civil code across France and every territory he conquered. Napoleon stripped the church of its record-keeping power and made birth registration a strictly legal, secular duty. Under the Napoleonic Code, parents were legally required to bring their newborn child or report the birth directly to the local mayor's office within 3 days. A few decades later, In 1836, Britain passed the Births and Deaths Registration Act, creating a central government office to track every human life in the country. Within a generation, almost every major government on Earth followed suit. This is where we have to stop and look at the darker side of the story, because this is where a helpful legal tool turned into something much more dangerous. Once a state insists that every human being must be registered at birth, it gains the power to decide who counts as a real person and who doesn't. Birth records were used to enforce racial segregation, trace bloodlines for discriminatory laws, and draft millions of young men into the brutal meat grinders of World Wars I and II. If the state had your birth record, it knew the exact day you turned 18, and it knew exactly where to find you to hand you a rifle. Even today, birth registration is the ultimate gatekeeper of human freedom. UNICEF estimates that roughly 164 million children under the age of 5 currently do not have a registered birth. They exist in physical reality, but legally, they are invisible. Without that record, they often cannot go to public school, receive hospital care, open a bank account, or get a passport. They are trapped in a legal shadowland. When you boil down 5,000 years of human history, the pattern becomes clear. Birth registration didn't start because governments wanted to send your baby a nice congratulatory card. It started because large societies cannot function without a way to measure human life. To give you rights, the state has to recognize you, but to collect taxes, enforce laws, and draft armies, the state has to track you. Simple as 1 + 1. So picture yourself back on that riverbank 5,000 years ago holding that baby under the clear blue sky. You look down at that tiny face, completely free, completely unknown to anyone outside your valley. Today, within hours of a baby's first cry, a form is filled out, a digital file is created, and a number is assigned. You carry that number in your pocket right now. It dictates where you can live, where you can travel, what job you can hold, and what laws apply to you. You are part of that 5,000-year ledger. You are living in that system right now.